I noticed that a common phrase you use is without regard to gender. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
It strikes me that if one wants to be treated without regard to gender, one should comport oneself without regard to gender. And along those lines, it's always struck me and still strikes me as nutty to think about one's gender if one doesn't want others to think about one's gender. I never walked into an NFL owners meeting, a football meeting, a meeting with bankers or business partners. I don't walk into a meeting with Ice Cube or anyone associated with the Big Three thinking about my gender. How is it fair for me, or how is it right for me, or how is it smart for me to want others not to think about my gender all the while thinking about my gender? I believe that, you know, any number of individualities are absolutely irrelevant to whether one can perform a job or not. Whether we're talking about gender, race, ethnicity, religion, those individualities have no bearing whatsoever on whether someone can do a job. I want to do my job without regard to gender. I want to be evaluated without regard to gender. I want to succeed or to fail without regard to gender. So when I say without regard to gender, that's really my shorthand way, I suppose, of saying I'm going to do my job, and I'm going to do my job without regard to gender, because that's irrelevant. And I want you to evaluate me without regard to gender, because that's irrelevant.
Wow, that's awesome. I was wondering, I read a quote from you that described a little frustration as to being called tough in your business dealings as CEO, because tough may not be considered such a negative term for a man.
Well, I think that may have been misconstrued. Perhaps I stated that poorly. I don't mind being called tough at all. And I have never viewed tough as a gender-specific word. I think what might have gotten a little bit lost in the translation on my part is there are instances in which I don't consider myself tough. I don't think tough is a bad word. I don't shy away from tough. There are instances in which I know that I am and I can be, and I'm glad to be, and I'm happy to be. But I think that what you may have sensed is the first time someone suggested to me that I was surprised, because I've never viewed myself that way. And if I am, that's fine.
As a woman, being called tough, do you think that can be a good thing?
I don't consider it good or bad. Look, the best advice I ever received in my life was from my mom. And she told me, as only moms can do, over and over and over and over again, and I won't take all your time to say over as many times as she actually told me, to thine own self be true. And as an aside, it wasn't until I was almost out of Cal, so I went to college, that I realized that my mom didn't coin that phrase. That was Shakespeare. And all those times my mother advised me, to thine own self be true, she was quoting Shakespeare from Hamlet. So whether Shakespeare or my mom, the best advice I've ever received. And the reason I share that with you is we have to be who we are to be our best. I really believe that. So I neither advise anyone to be tough, nor do I advise them to not be tough. We have to do what works for us to be our best, I believe. I've now learned, as I've grown, that I am tough, and I can be tough, and that's fine. And that's good in instances. It doesn't mean that works for everybody. I don't think we should shy away from comporting ourselves in the manner my mom advised, true to ourselves.
I noticed that you said once the only things that you regret were moments when you weren't true to yourself. Can you recall any specific moment that happened and when you realized that?
You know, there have only been one or two instances in which I didn't trust my gut, and I didn't listen enough, and I therefore wasn't true to myself, if that's how we want to express that. And I don't remember the particular, there was one business instance in which I knew a business decision we were making wasn't the right one, and I didn't listen to myself enough. It was early in my career, and that's one instance.
Was that with the Raiders? Or?
Yes, yes, early in my career. And what I learned as a result of that is listen to yourself.
It seems like you're someone who never takes no for an answer.
That has been said to me before, and it's not something I've given a lot of thought to. If there's a reason to change my mind, I change my mind. I value input. I think the four most important words in business are communicate, cooperate, collaborate, and coordinate. And so in making decisions, I rely on my teammates, and I value, I cherish, I welcome, I elicit communication and collaboration. But yes, when I reach a decision, I certainly will be what some would call tenacious in pursuing the outcome that we collectively have decided is the right outcome, or that I believe is the right outcome. As we talk through this concept of tough, I'm very direct. I've been told I'm direct to a fault. I don't believe that there really is such a thing as direct to a fault. Let me not even equivocate. I don't believe there is such a thing as direct to a fault. I think in many regards the world would be better if we were all more direct. But it is possible that what someone perceive as toughness is also my direct approach, and I think those two may go hand in hand. But I am direct, and I can be very tough.
Yeah. I'm remembering a story I read about where you were in a meeting and someone was trying to say, we need to move on. Maybe it was the commissioner or something.
Right.
And you just kept trying to make your point over and over again. Could you share that story with us?
Sure. And I was going to, with a big smile on my face, and teasingly say, I wasn't trying to make my point. I did make my point. And I say that in good spirit, and since there's a camera, if I happen to be on it at this moment, please know there's a smile on my face. Yeah, it was a moment at a league owners meeting. Owners meetings were, for the most part, 2 per club, often 1 per club. Those are the owners meeting at which the real work gets done. There are owners meetings which include larger contingents from teams, but this was either a 1 or a 2 per club meeting. But in our sense, the Raiders, it was a 1 per club meeting. I was the only one there. Actually, let me rethink that. It was a 1 or a 2 per club meeting, but the reason I'm sharing that is Al wasn't there. Al Davis wasn't there. I was there, and there was now that I think about it, there was another representative of the club. It was a 2 per club meeting. And as was the case at meetings, people from teams, owners or executives from teams got up and shared thoughts. And the owner of another team got up and shared some thoughts that I found very troubling. And I believe that we needed to address them. We, being the Raiders, needed to respond to those thoughts, to address them. So I did as was the case. When one wanted to speak, stood up, walked to the microphone closest to the table at which that team was sitting, and began to speak, at which point the commissioner, who, by the way, was not now Commissioner Roger Goodell, it was then Commissioner Paul Tagliabue, shortly after I started speaking, interrupted and said, well, we're going to move on right now. And I hadn't gotten out more than a word or two out, and I started to speak, and he said, well, we're going to move on right now. And I didn't move. I said, no, I have something to say. And he said, well, we've got to move on. We've spent time on this, we've got to move along. And I said, no, I have something, no. And I don't think I kept saying I have something to say as much as I kept starting to say it. And, I didn't budge. I stood at that microphone, and there were a few attempts to say, let's move on, and I stayed there. And ultimately he said, okay, well, go ahead, but make it quick. And I made the points that I believed I needed to make on behalf of the Raider organization. Now, after the meeting, a number of owners of other teams approached me, as did executives and league officials, commenting on that moment in which I refused to sit down. And they commented that they thought that was tough. Well, it never, ever occurred to me for a moment that what I was doing was tough or strong or argumentative. It was quite simple from my perspective. I had a point, that I believed was important to the organization for which I worked to make. And I had a job to do representing my organization. So I made the point. And I want to be quick to note, and I did note this when I shared the story in the book that I wrote, I don't believe that Paul Tagliabue's desire to silence me or move the meeting along or hurry me away from the microphone was in any way gender related. I'm absolutely sure that it was not. I believe he would have done that had I been a male employee of another club. I don't believe he would have done it if I were the owner of a club, but I wasn't the owner, I was an executive, and I think he would have treated me in the same manner without regard to gender. But, you know, it just never occurred to me to sit down. I represented an organization. There was a point I believed it was important for our organization to make. I believed it was my responsibility to make that point, and it just never occurred to me not to make it.
Speaking of your book, can you tell us a little bit about why you titled it You Negotiate Like a Girl?
My thought for the title of the book was Without Regard. And when I sort of envisioned writing a book, I came up with an idea of the title, and it was going to be Without Regard, which was going to be my shorthand way of saying without regard to gender. Well, when I decided to write the book, I gathered all my courage and contacted the tremendous Mike Freeman, who I don't know if you know about Mike, but sensational, sensational writer, and an even more spectacular human being. You know, people often talk about his writing prowess. I talk about his prowess as a human. But when I approached him and said, you know, I love to write, and I'm writing and writing and writing and writing, but I've never done a book. Will you help me? And he graciously agreed. And at one point in reading the anecdotes and stories and thoughts that I had written down, he read the story in which I was told, you negotiate like a girl. And he suggested that as a title for the book. And I immediately, like I often do, said, oh, no, 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 you know, without regard, without regard. And he said, okay, but I really think that's a good title for the book. And the more I thought about it and the more I thought about it, I realized he is absolutely, positively right. So all credit for the title of the book goes to Mike Freeman.
It reminds me of people trying to reclaim you throw like a girl to be actually a compliment instead of an insult. Do you think like sort of reclaiming, you know, because that used to be an insult, like do you think of it as a compliment now?
Well, I did not accept it as an insult when it was said. I mean, so when you talk about reclaiming, this is not reclaiming after the fact on my part. When I was told someone in like frustration, a moment of frustration or anger said, you know, you negotiate like a girl. I didn't take it as an insult at that time. And in fact, I laughed. You know, my reaction wasn't to get angry. It wasn't to get mad or upset or bothered. I laughed and I said, okay, you know, negotiate it yourself. And the fact is he didn't want to negotiate it himself. He wanted the girl to negotiate it for him, which I did.
Can you give us the background on that story?
Yeah, the background is that I was with the Raiders at the time, and we were working on a very, very, very important transaction, a transaction that was of critical importance to the organization. And it was a big transaction, and we were... there was stress associated with it and frustration, and at this particular moment I was having a conversation with Al Davis, and he was frustrated and angry and not happy with the pace and the manner in which the negotiations were proceeding, and he sort of fired out at me at one point, you negotiate like a girl. And that's when I laughed, and you know, my response was to laugh and say to him, oh, okay, you can go ahead and negotiate it. And he didn't want to. He wanted the girl to negotiate it. And I went on and did it and negotiated a very, very good transaction.
I'm wondering about the...
You know, can I back up 1 second and add to that? You know, people ask me, did I get angry when he said that? Did I get mad? Did I yell at him? And the answer is no. Because the fact is, he trusted me to negotiate this transaction. He trusted me to handle what was something of such critical importance. And this is the man who hired me without regard to my gender, and advanced me without regard to my gender, and trusted me and relied upon me without regard to my gender. And so he spit that out in a moment of frustration, and my reaction was to laugh because I knew he didn't mean it. All he meant was he was not happy with the negotiations. He was not happy with the way I was handling things. He expressed it in that manner, and I laughed, and I told him to negotiate it himself, and he didn't want to.
Wow. And I mean, so many, like if I put myself in your place, I think I would have some voice in my head like, oh, like, that's an insult. And instead of seeing it as clearly as you did, and seeing that the insult didn't have to do with you being a girl, it had to do with the things that you were doing.
Absolutely, that was well stated. I mean, clearly he was not happy with the negotiations. Clearly he was not happy with the manner in which I was handling it. It had nothing to do with my gender. And I'd been with him at that point for well over a quarter of a century, or roughly a quarter of a century, and I knew my gender was irrelevant to him. It was almost like someone spitting something out on a playground, and that was the insult or the comment that came to his mind, and there was no doubt in my mind he didn't mean it. And really, I did. I laughed, and boy, did that make him mad when he was so angry and being critical of the negotiation that my response was to laugh in his face and tell him to negotiate it himself, and the fact is he didn't want to. He trusted me to do it.
I guess I'm wondering if you can share advice, straight to me and me as an audience, maybe looking to hear like that tactic as a piece of advice, like focus on what the real issue is. Like if other people go low, go high. I mean, not that he was going low, he was in a moment of, when people are in moments of frustration, they go low. And you need to like hear what the actual issue is and focus on the real business behind it.
And again, let's harken back to thine own self be true. Each one of us reacts differently in different situations, and I'm loath to criticize anyone for the manner in which they react or respond, and others will respond differently in a situation than I did. I don't get offended. I don't get, maybe offended is the right word. I was going to say comments, insulted, that's another word. I don't get offended, I don't get insulted. So even if someone intends something as an insult, which Al didn't, even if someone intends something as an insult, I don't care. What do I care if someone wants to hurl invective my way? If someone wants to say something which they believe or intend to be an insult or to offend me, I don't need to allow them to do that. And I've never given that great thought. It's never been a strategy on my part. It's never been an affirmative decision to not care about what others say when they're intending to offend or insult. I just don't care. And so I guess, the way you articulated that is really wise and far better than I'm articulating it. Focus on the substance. Do your job. The best response, if you will, to an insult or to a comment about one's ability is to succeed. Look, we are all tested in life. People ask me all the time, was I tested because I'm a woman? Yeah, maybe. But we're all tested at different times for different reasons. We're tested because we're the newest person on the job. We're tested because we're the youngest, or because of our gender, or our race, or our ethnicity, or our religion. Well, what's the best answer when one is tested? Pass the damn test. So I always viewed my energy and my effort as best spent on doing my job and not worrying about anything else, because the best answer to any test is to succeed.
Do you feel proud, though gender is, not obviously something that you've focused on, now looking back on everything you've done so far, are you particularly proud of that you maybe opened that door for so many women?
No. I'm going to answer that in two ways. If what I did opened any doors, well, then that's terrific. And I'm thrilled that other women are enjoying opportunities within the league and otherwise. But am I proud of that? No. I never thought about it. When I walked into that to my first owners meeting shortly after I began with the Raiders in the mid-'80s, I didn't think about my gender. When someone mentioned to me that I was the first woman to attend such a meeting, I said, oh, it's not something I thought about. So no, I don't take pride in it. I don't think about it. If it did open doors, well then that's special, but I don't think about it.
I'm wondering about this, the FU fund.
Oh, right.
Can you tell us what that is?
Sure. Very, very early in my career, I hadn't been with the organization more than a few months. Not during my internship, but this was after I started full-time. I went home one night and I was fairly newly married, pretty newly married, and my husband and I were living paycheck to paycheck, as many newly married couples do, and we really were eking it out in that regard. And I went home and I said to him, and by the way, I don't want to swear on this, so how about if I just use a word that rhymes with, well, we'll just call it the FU fund. I won't say it out. One day I went home and I said, at some point, Al is going to say to me, F you, one time too many for my mood at that particular moment, and I'm going to say no, F you. And one of two things is going to happen. Either he's going to fire me or I'm going to quit. So my husband and I then decided we would set up a fund that we named the FU fund, only we said the actual word. And by the way, this whole conversation, Al never said to me, F you. I'm using abbreviations out of sensitivity for this recording. The actual word was used everywhere. I'm using the word F right now. But we set up a fund in which we spelled it out, the FU fund, and every single paycheck we put a little bit in, as much as we could. Each paycheck we put a little bit in that fund. And we named it that so that when that moment came and I said no, FU, only I said it out, we had our FU fund set up. And when that fund got to a little bit in size so that I felt free to do so, it was a very, very nice feeling. Now the fact is, over the course of my career, he said that to me more times than I could ever count. I said that to him more times than I could count, and he never did fire me, and I never did quit. But to this day, for sentimental reasons, we still have our FU fund. Two things. I swore a lot with him all the time. And I don't think I actually waited until the fund was fully funded, if you will, to do so. Look, I worked for a football team for almost 30 years. That word is used like the word the. It is not aberrational. But at the beginning of my career, I didn't know how free I could feel directing that invective at the owner of the team. And this is all sort of shorthand for saying that I did, and to me the significance of this is, I did and my husband did what freed me up to act in any manner. I felt that early in our marriage and in my life, I needed to make sure that my husband knew and we agreed that I was going to comport myself exactly how I wished. But there could be financial ramifications on us for so doing, and that's why we set up the fund.
So can you with those disclaimers in place, tell me the time when about the time.
I don't remember.
You don't remember?
I absolutely. Yeah, and that's my point. That's the way we conversed. So I don't remember.
Yeah.
I do remember, and I'll share this story. You'll use it if you want or not, of course. But I do remember one particular instance in which the topic of swearing came up in a meeting I attended with Al, and we were at a meeting in our facility. A business came in. And we were a number of us on staff. I think it was me plus three or more other people on Raiders staff were in this meeting, and Al joined us. And he walked in, and one of the individuals, one of the representatives of the business with whom we were meeting, was a woman. And he was very gracious and introduced himself to everybody, and then said to this woman, I try very hard not to swear in front of women, So please forgive me if or please accept my apologies. I don't know exactly how he articulated, but I'm sorry if I swear in front of you. Well, I start looking around the room from one coworker to another. When he says, I try very hard not to swear in front of women, I'm looking from one coworker to the other like, what's he saying? Well, then he goes on and says to this woman, and even if I do, occasionally swear in front of a woman, I never swear at a woman. Well, now I'm looking at my coworkers. I am looking from person to person, and the look on my face is one of absolute incredulity. And I was so stunned by this when he said, I never swear at a woman. The pen I was holding flew out of my hand, landed with a thud on the table. I'm looking at all my coworkers, and Al catches this look of incredulity on my face, and he says, oh, Amy, I swear at Amy, but I don't consider her a woman. And I'm getting goosebumps right now as I recount this story for you. Because what a moment. I mean, that was one of the most special moments of my career. And it was a career full of special moments. But when Al said to a group of, when you count our staff in this business, 15 or more people, oh, Amy, I swear at Amy, but I don't consider her a woman. What a special moment. Isn't that what we want? Isn't that what we hope and we dream and we expect? That we will be treated and evaluated and promoted or fired or regarded in every way without regard to gender. So if I want to be treated without regard to gender, well then swear at me without regard to gender. And here was the owner of this team saying, oh, Amy, I swear at Amy, but I don't consider her a woman. Well, wasn't that my hope and my dream and my expectation that he would interact with me and treat me without regard to gender?